CEO of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. I want to welcome you all to our Business Lunch series. We've got quite a few sponsors. We couldn't do this without them, and I'd like to thank them now. And those sponsors are Bank of America, Garmin, Gilmore & Bell, McCowney Gordon Construction, Mid-American Nazarenes, K-State Olathe, Terracon, and the University of Kansas Health System. Can we give them a round of applause? Well, as you know, there's within the economy, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of different factors, and one thing we wanted to share with you is different perspectives. So we have individuals that can talk about the federal level, the regional level, and we can break it down into the local Johnson County market as well too. So with that, I'm going to ask our speakers to come and join us here. Instead of me introducing them and giving them their background, go ahead. I'm going to have them give them with their presentation. Each one of them is going to do a small presentation, and then I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we will, if we have time, have some questions for you all that we'd love to throw at them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy Hill with Federal Reserve.
All right, well, thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right, so I think everyone's nodding so you can hear me. So yeah, I'm at the Kansas City Federal Reserve. I used to be at the University of Wichita State for 15 years, studied regional economies. I came over in a position they created just recently. The position is to be engaged with communities, going to talk about the economy and listening to stories so I can get that back to Jeff, our president, so when he ends up being a member right now, and make decisions. So that's a little bit about my background. I have a couple people in the room, so I have Chandler and Becky. Becky helped always pulls the data for me. Chandler helps us to assist and get me engaged and out in this community. So reach with me or reach with them. They have magazines and business cards to keep it all of you. Let me think about this broader economy. There's 4 components I thought I'd share. Talk about labor, since labor got a little spicy here this last week. Talk about inflation, also another spicy topic. Housing and then firms. Before I do, I always give these stories, kind of give some color of how the economy has changed. And so when I went around the state back last fall, I used the theme of kaleidoscope. The reason why is because we had all these distortions in the market, and finally last fall, I said, I know where demand is, I know where supply is, I know where labor is, I know where inputs, I know where supply, and everything was making things are getting clear. The first quarter of this year, I used building blocks. Right? I wanted to do GDP, but I thought people thought it was going to fall apart. I can't use the name because of this Federal Reserve, so we couldn't get trademark for that. So I did building blocks. You have one of the foundations economies. There's a couple weaknesses, but there's a lot going on. The second quarter of this year, I went to this economic tug of war. What's pulling us back and forth? It's not a bad thing, it's just where are we moving and how is it shifting this economy? Right? And that's what a lot of firms are thinking about. How do I shift my products into them? How do I think about it? And as we go in this quarter, I'm thinking about a periscope. Think about a submarine. We are all through this market looking very narrowly on a few things of what's going to go on and how to anticipate the future. So let's talk about the labor market first. For the labor market, we said we're growing at a higher rate than it revised down May and June. And July numbers are also pretty low. But how do you put this in context, right? A natural rate of growth is between 80,000 and 100,000. Natural rate is, my son just graduated high school, by the way, he's 18. He's now in the labor market. That's the natural rate of growth, just how the economy expands and will come in. And when you look at this, we need 80 to 100. So going down to about 15 in May and June means we're below the natural rate of growth, right? How do you put this in perspective? Well, you got to back up in the rear view a little bit. So if you look at January, February, we're much higher than the natural rate of growth. December was 300-some thousand, and all of last year, 2024, we were very hot. So we were in a market that was pretty hot, and you can only go so far before the market kind of reached stabilization. Better things to look at the labor market is the amount of openings versus hiring. And those are magic, right? Those are still magic. when I go and ask firms what's going on in the labor market, back in May, when I was going around, labor was not even a concern. Not a concern. Not laying off, not a concern. Just slowing down based on economic conditions. Same thing with June. Same thing now. People are starting to bring up some more stories this summer. Depends on what sector we're looking at. But some stories started to come up a little bit more. Just if all of that labor went way low, and it says it's a slowing economy, we need to watch it. Does that periscope, we need to watch it for the next couple months to tell us the information about if the economy is slowing down or not. But in this district, firms were very optimistic about labor. It just wasn't where they focused. It was trading inflation. So let me go over to inflation. Inflation, it was starting to heat up in January, came closer to our target. Federal Reserve has 7% as a stable price, and has been coming back up. The most recent reading on this inflation was that around 2.7%, big part of it, food. That is clearly tariff related. Tariff is making food coming in more expensive. Goods is also coming up, also very clearly tariff related. So we're having some of this pressure underneath this market as well. And that's going to put some concerns as we think about going into the future. Bigger, longer term, what's likely to happen with the tariffs and inflation? There's still pressures to really work through this market. So far, you think about back in April's, right? We're not getting much goods. People make orders. By the time we get those orders in and overseas, that can start in July and June. But we had backlogs, burning them all, so we can mitigate some of those risks. Firms are making all these other choices on how to manage some of the households are changing preferences and also keeping some of that inflationary pressure down. So it's not necessary for our conclusion that we have this massive inflationary, because we're looking at it in the front windshield to see all the risk out there. People are managing some of it, but some of that's clearly coming into this market. Households. Back in May, you remember those surveys? Perceptions dropped in May, right? Labor market dropped in May too. So May's a theme here, right? Perceptions dropped. However, what are the fundamentals? We still stayed employed. Real income is actually above. Real income's above inflation on the aggregate. Households are still making money. We stopped spending in May, but we actually been back to spending. So that activity of tariffs really slowed down activity in May. So that could be part of the reason why May numbers got revised down. Firms are holding down, households holding down, hunkering down. Now, are all households doing great? Absolutely not. We're talking about the lowest fifth of the population. They have been struggling. You can see some of their debt rising, and that's becoming a bigger issue, right? Their real incomes are not keeping up with the inflation. That's smallest, the lowest income. And I actually talked to a great organization around here. The number of hardship applications have been doubling the last couple months for very low income households. I guess the last segment is the firm side. You go all the way back. You think about their confidence. When was their lowest confidence? What month? It wasn't May. It was actually April. They were really sour in April when they heard about a lot of the tariff, and they were still sour in May when it got a little bit better. And they still feel better and better. So each time I went around to the district, around kids, talk to firms, most firms don't like uncertainty, but they're looking at their business very localized. I'm still doing well. And that was even the case this last month. When we talked to firms on our boards, they're very optimistic about the market. They just do not like the uncertainty of what's going on. So when you get back to the, why do I think it's Periscope? Right? When you look out there, we need to look at employment very closely, because that's a signal of, do we have demand, hire people? Are we out there engaging? When you look at his inflation number, because inflation if it does keep coming up, it's going to have other effects in the broader market. Then you come over here to the household side, are they still spending? And right now, even as I asked around here, on tourism, things like that, people are saying they're still spending even in this market. So real income's there, they're spending on the aggregate, there's some weaknesses. And on the firm side, what's the health and confidence right now? Right now, most firms are doing well. There are some that are weak. There's some that are having real issues with supply chains, which we'll get into later in this discussion. That's probably about my 10 minutes. All right, good. All right, thank you very much.
We are going to now pivot into the region, and Frank is going to come and speak to us at email. So a couple ones. We're going to assuming he found it. Was down years old. That's not thing. And Jerry, thank you. I think I know we talked earlier today. There are a number of other issues that hopefully we get into, like all the interest rates, things that make all.
You ready for asking questions? Yeah, that's part of this. Candle later.
Yeah. So I'm Frank Lake. I direct the Office of Economic Research at the Mid-America Regional Council. There we go. And I've been there for a long time. It was my first job out in school, and still love it. They hired me really to do this work, which is do a long-range forecast, not looking out 6 months to a year or 2 years, but to look out 30 years. To figure out how industry is going to grow and develop, and where it's going to grow and where it might not grow. As part of our long-range transportation planning process. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So as I said, it's part of our new plan that we just adopted in June. You can go to the website and find it. And we ask a lot of questions about this plan, but the one that most relates to me is what should our transportation system look like between now and 2050? Well, you can't answer that if you don't know how many people are going to be, or where they're going to live, or where the jobs are, how many jobs we got. So that's what I do, and these forecasts were just adopted by our board of directors along with the plan. It's something that we have to update every 4 or 5 years, it takes a couple of years of work to do it. Shortening that time frame so we can update more frequently is on my agenda. This work is overseen by a group of mainly city and county planners from around the region, they provide input and try to keep me honest in letting you sort of make a forecast. I'll show you more about where they really provide the most input. We start with a regional model of how the Kansas City economy competes with the nation. This is sort of a typical forecast that we're growing, but sort of modestly. Things are slowing down, though, not just in the short run right now, but we see that moving forward as well, that we're sort of rebounding from COVID this decade, but beyond that, we see significantly slower growth over the next 20 years, 30 years. The main reason is not really coming from something locally, but it's coming from the assumptions we make about demographics nationally. It's sort of we use population figures from the Census Bureau, and they showed dramatically lower births being projected compared to their prior forecast. That's mainly because of this. And so if you have anyone of in the 20s and 30s, you realize that they're not having nearly as many kids as Los Angeles used to have. And that trend doesn't seem to abate. But usually what happens, there's the baby boom. That's my generation there back in 1960. We had a baby bust, and then it stabilized for a very long time. And typically it fluctuates with the business cycle. If people think things are good, they have more babies. Things are bad, fewer babies. But this last trend really started with the Great Recession. So things were bad, so people were having fewer babies. But it never rebound. People at times got better. So that's what's different right now, is that we're not sure where the bottom is. This is a cool little animation going back to 1900, showing you as it dips in. That was with the Great Depression, and then followed fairly quickly by the baby boom as it expands out. This is national data, not local. And then the baby bust, as I said, and then followed right around 2000 with the millennial and Gen Z population, or this with that, just the where it sort of ended up. You can see that the millennial, push there. Millennials are now the biggest generation. The baby are still large, but declining. You see just many fewer babies being born now than used to. And so that means household sizes are going down. As many kids in the household, older households as well. And so the baby boomers are beginning to die off. So that has implications for how many housing units we need. And so the Technical Forecast Committee works with us to provide a lot of input about what your plans are on character growth and development, where growth will happen, what kind of development are you expecting, and we just absorb that. We have a model that tells us which areas are most likely to grow, and so the models are saying we got all this land, and the grade is all the vacant agricultural land we could develop. Will all of that develop by 2050? Well, the answer is no. But which is the most likely to develop? That's what we use a model for this. So we use the technical forecast to tell us what things will develop as, and then also what's the current pipeline of development, so we can get it in that. And so the pattern of development looks fairly similar to the prior decades development pattern, where there's a lot of growth. Most of it's still concentrated sort of on the outside, but what's new compared to the last century is instead of decline in the core, we have growth in the core. That's different for us, and it's a healthier region when we have growth everywhere. What's a little different from this forecast than that of one we are superseding is that because household sizes decline, areas that are perfectly stable in terms of households will see slight population decline. So that's the red that you're seeing up here in many of the developed areas of town. Employment is the hardest thing for us to forecast because a single decision of it's not like all of a sudden you've got 8,000 jobs being forecast for an area that had 1,000 or so. So it's really hard to forecast. This forecast is showing you some growth around the extended streetcar line, as well as trying to capture those major data centers and industrial developments on the edges. Then we have sort of big employment centers being created on the edges. Will create demand for housing then on the edges, so that's why the pattern rate is still mostly occurring on the edges, with also redevelopment occurring to set on. Added up by county, Johnson County is projected to be the fastest growing county, followed by Jackson, then Clay and Platte, by Cass, it looks like. Population change, pretty similar, but there's a bigger difference because Johnson County's household sizes are larger than investments. So that's something that shows up. Employment's sort of being allocated right now based on where employment currently is. Again, I think this is our weakest model, and so it may be that Johnson actually ends up going faster than Jackson. That's really been the case in recent years. So a little bit of a surprise there. We make this forecast using a model that actually works about like a census block level, so very detailed. We add things up to get to the census tract and county, city level. You can see that Olathe is the third fastest growing city according to this forecast. And all that data is available online, and you can just get it and download it and use it to your Arson test. So just quick view of the forecast, and basically showing Johnson County still continue to be a leader to reuse roads. Now, thanks, Mike, for reading. Now we're going to dive into the data set with Siri, and it's more on Johnson County and dive down. We'll get further down into Johnson County. This means that nothing.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Doug Davidson. I'm with the County Economic Research Institute, better known as Siri. You were Siri or Amble. We've been around in Johnson County since the mid-'80s. Actually, Town's father, Dennis Vicky, late Dennis Vicky, was the founding director of Siri. So I've known Tim a long time. I've been there 35 years since I was a mere child at Siri, but we are a nonprofit funded primarily from Johnson County government. Our board is made up of a mix of business leaders throughout the county. Tim Bartman is on our board, and our chair, and this as Jason Light, also one on chair of Siri's board. So our board is a mix of businesses of various industries throughout Johnson County, but also every economic development director in the county is on for board. all the city, we need director John with Siri board. But we try to provide the data that economic developers need to answer questions from prospects, provide that labor market data, the wage data, and then also to kind of monitor the economies, kind of keep our finger on the pulse. Try to get about a 30-minute presentation on the treasure. Squeeze it about 6 minutes. This is Johnson County's population over the last 25 years or so. This last pale orange bar is our estimate for this year's population. The rest of those are official Bureau annual estimates. You see we're at 600. It took 30+ thousand down in population. This is our annual population change in the bars, and then that orange line corresponds to the right-hand scales and a two scale on each side. That's the annual percentage growth rate. So you can see our population continues to grow, but we're growing at a declining rate. This is the components of our population change over the last several years. So those components are made up of the numbers of births, which is in blue, and then minus the numbers of deaths, people passing away. That's the yellow. You'll notice that's below zero. So those are actually negative numbers, subtracting from population growth. The green is net domestic migration. So that's people moving in and out of Johnson County from within the United States. And the key takeaway here is that notice that the green bars have switched to the negative the last 2 years. So there are more people leaving Johnson County to other places in the U.S. than are coming in. That's the first time we've ever seen that in data we have going back several decades. And then the orange is net international. So numbers of people moving in from outside the U.S. minus those who leave out. So these are net numbers. And you can see during COVID, the international migration shrank. It had been trending somewhat down anyway, but then we've seen a rebound, a big boom in that. What we don't know going forward is, our expectation would be that would come back down. If that's the last few years, that's the last couple of years, that's been the largest component really contributing to our population growth. So if that goes away, our population, or that comes down dramatically, our population growth is going to slowly further. This is the latest population estimates. We're estimating that this year the city will cross over 150,000. And that's a bit of a swag, I will admit. The effects on immigration, which are happening rapidly, could affect that forecast. And again, this is the annual change, the number change in the green bars, and then that yellow line is the annual percentage rate. Olathe accounts for about 24% of the left-hand pie chart, and 24% of the county's population. And between 2020 and 2024, the city accounted for about 35% of Johnson County population. Great. This is gross domestic product in Johnson County. You can see a big boom in 2022 over almost 11% growth in GDP coming out of the pandemic. And then slowed in 2023. We won't get 2024 data until December of this year. It lags almost a year. So, and that's the case with all local data. It's always later. There's less of it, and it's always later. So the national data comes out first. State data will come after that. The county data, if it's available, will come out later. GDP on the left-hand side. This is showing what portion of statewide GDP Johnson County accounts for. We're the largest economy in the state, accounting for almost 32%, almost a third of the total GDP statewide. Sedgwick County is second place at just under 18%. And now on the right-hand side,
looking at the 5-year change from 2018 to 2023, Johnson County accounted for 64.5% of the growth in GDP statewide. These charts show the same relationship to the Kansas City metro area. So in 2023, we account for 38.2% of GDP metro-wide, which is larger than Jackson County at 33.5%. And then our share of the growth between 2018 and 2023, over half of GDP growth metro-wide was in Johnson County. This is total employment dating back to 2019, the last year prior to the pandemic, and you see that big dive in April of 2020. And then those two call-out boxes are indicating the point at which we recovered post-pandemic the level of employment we had prior to the pandemic hitting in the stay-at-home orders and those sorts of things. It took us a full 2 years to recover the jobs that we lost. We initially lost about 42,000 jobs in Johnson County and started to rebuild those, but it took us a full 2 years to recover to our pre-pandemic employment level. This is illustrating, this is monthly data for the last several years. So at the county level, you hear about data being seasonally adjusted. Most people kind of gloss over that. Most local data is not seasonally adjusted, so you can't compare CARPs in April or April to May. You would compare April this year to April last year. So anytime you see data that's not seasonally adjusted, you know that you need to compare to the same time period. And so that's why we overlay these month by month. And this doesn't really, the reason we do this is because here at the month we'll get first quarter's worth of data, so we can start to see this year how we did in the first quarter this year as to last year. At this point we've got full year data, but you can see from the table here that our employment growth is slowed down dramatically. In 2024, we are still growing, but at a slower rate. This is comparing industry by industry, 2023 versus 2024. And I just kind of highlighted here on the table here, top employment industries at the top right. Healthcare is the largest employer in the county. That sector employs over 53,000 people, followed by technical and professional services, which include engineering, accounting, legal services. Retail is third. And then that middle group is the top gainers in that 1 year time period. Manufacturing actually turned out to be number one, and that's before Panasonic came to town and started hiring folks. So the industry to see the next couple of years that I'd anticipate manufacturing have strong employment growth, which is a big change from us historically. Johnson County's economy is largely service-based, and healthcare and technical and professional services are the leading industries, and they've been the leading job creators. But that's at least in this 1 year time frame. That is changing a little bit. And then actually the industries that lost employment, healthcare actually lost a few jobs, 392 jobs. Wages are growing, and they actually accelerated in 2024. Increased was 3.2% growth in annual wage in 2023, and that ticked up to 5.1% last year. It's not a little more timely data. This is the labor force statistics, which we get on a monthly basis. So we have data through June, and I'm just kind of showing you the last several years. The orange at the bottom, that's the COVID year 2020. What I want to point out is the top two bars. The red is 2024. The black is this year, and our labor force is growing still, but not by very much. Year to date, we're up 0.7%.
And then, every year before that, it was over 1%, right, and labor force. Of that labor force, how many Johnson Countyans are employed? Same story. Year to date, we've grown by only 0.3%. Except called out there at the bottom there. Olathe's numbers, 61,000 Olathe residents employed. It's nearly a quarter of countywide total are labor residents. And then unemployment rate, you see a huge spike in April 2020. We've spiked up to 11%. Unemployment was the highest on record in Johnson County. Fortunately, it was short-lived. You see that precipitous drop later in the year, but our unemployment rate is still quite low, 3.6% average year to date, up from 3.3 last year. So it's very low, but it is creeping up. Olathe tends to be at or maybe a tenth below the countywide average, and so year to date in Olathe, that's 3.5%. These are 30-year mortgage rates. As we all know, the response to the pandemic, the Fed lowered rates dramatically. Interest rates in general came down to record low levels. Mortgage rates came down to 3% or below. And that fueled a boom in the single-family housing in Johnson County, and boom in sales of homes. A bit in construction as well, but the numbers of homes sold. So 2020, we took a brief pause as the initial stay-at-home orders came in from the governor's office. Home sales paused just a month or so, and then they took off. By the end of the year 2020, we set a record in Johnson County for the most homes ever sold. 2021 set another record. And so those are the two highest sales years of single-family homes in Johnson County history. And then rates started coming up quite dramatically into 2022 and 2023. We see those big negative numbers and decline in sales volume. Year to date this year, we're up almost 10% from last year. Last year, was a relatively, for recent history, relatively low base. And then here at the bottom, you can see kind of the breakout between sales of new homes versus resales. Resales dominate the market, as you would expect. About 85+% of the market are resales, and 15% or so are new homes. New homes are kind of ticking up. They're 15% more new homes have sold this year as occurred in the same period last year, whereas resales are only up 8.7%. This is inventory. Inventory is quite tight. Those pale gray bars are 2019, so I left those on there to kind of show you what the pre-pandemic market level of the inventory of homes listed for sale was in Johnson County. And if you were to look at those numbers and compare them to most other counties around the nation, you would have said that's a really tight housing market. There's not much inventory. That's pretty typical for Johnson County, but we've gotten much tighter than that. This is the same data expressed as the number of months worth of inventory at the pace of sales at present. So year to date, we're at 1.9 months worth of inventory, which is very, very low. The prices of homes have accelerated quite dramatically, especially during the kind of immediate post-pandemic period. You see in 2021, 12.8% growth in the sales price, 13% in 2022, and then that's pulled back down. Year to date, we're at 3.7%. Resale homes are averaging 550,000 through the first 6 months of the year. That's up 5.3% in price as compared to a year ago. New homes, 725,000 is the average sales price for the first 6 months of the year. That's actually down a little bit, but it's a much smaller
volume of sales. And so, some big homes can change that one way or another. So in the next month or two, if some big numbers, that could go from a negative price difference to positive pretty quickly. Building permits, builders responded to the strong market, especially initially in 2021, but we've been cooling back in 2022, 2023. 2023 was the fewest number of permits at 2012, and then we've been rebuilding that since. Multifamily is much more, I'll say volatile, and the data is more volatile in that, some projects could be several hundred units, and so that can change the trajectory quite rapidly. But we, the last couple of 3 years, multifamily has really slowed down in Johnson County. This is non-residential building permits that we collect this data from all the permit issuing entities in the county. This is a breakdown of by major categories that we track. So in 2024, there was right at 200,000 square feet in retail permitted, which is below the 10-year average of 270,000. You see those green bars; those are in that's industrial space. So the large warehouse distribution centers fall into that category, and that's been the dominant square foot, category of square footage we've added to buildings we count. And then taxable retail sales. Retail sales boomed during pandemic with stay-at-home, or people traveling, going vacation, and were investing in their homes, buying furnishings, remodeling their homes, and so really we in 2021 to way above historic averages. But you can see it so far in 2025 we're at 4.6%, which is that's actually quite strong. And then this is the same data for Olathe. You notice Olathe's data is a little bit volatile in terms of bouncing around month to month, but on the year-to-date average, it's up 1.8%, which is a little later countywide average. But roughly 21.5% of retail sales, taxable retail sales, countywide, occurs in Olathe. I think that is the last slide. If you have any questions? Yeah. And hopefully you have a mic. I've got a prepared question, but we thought we would ask if there's anyone that might have a question of our panelists. We could throw that out. So if not, I'm prepared for a couple of questions. But is there anyone in the crowd that has a question?
Yep. Basically. Debbie Bergami, canvassing University of Lake. And I saw that in the housing market in Johnson County, there was a couple years that had huge amount of growth in like price of housing. You predict that will be adjusted later on, but an increase in housing as population decreases, but not have the same growth of good sector today.
Well, those big increases, it's on. It's working. Those big increases, and you're talking about price. Yeah. During the immediate post-pandemic boom, prices were really great, higher by demand. With those low interest rates, there was a huge influx of demand for homes here. A lot of trading up of homes that really drove that increase. It's come down since then, but there's a lot of pricing pressure still in the housing market. The cost to develop, cost of land, cost of infrastructure for new development is going to remain a factor to keep prices up. I really don't see prices moderating.
Thank you.
French, Germany, so they show I'm sure
We've had out of the only prices are very sticky downward. And so once they go up, they kind of stay up. But stuff commodities just eat fluctuations way us in the top fact.
So you mentioned a couple elements, but the ability to build houses for is so demand and supply of housing is off. The action is off here. So there's a lot more demand than there's supply, and the capacity to build it is still lacks. And in this market, all this market is better than other markets. You can't build your way out. So that's going to be this continuous pressures on the housing stock. Question is affordability. And affordability is actually, although here New Lake is not, but affordability is still better here than many other markets across the nation. When you look at the share of your income going to housing, it's not that severely burdened household, which is over 30-some%, especially when we go up 50% in some other markets. That's a lot less here than it is in other markets. Now it's more significant here, but not as significant for them market. So that pressure is on there as well, which prices up. The gentleman, the James Trussler with IT Solutions. One for Jeremy. You mentioned the KPI for household is that they're still spending a tighter your health indicator. Do you know how they're spending? Like, is that we're sitting down much saving because the job market accounting time going? Are we like part of them dead? Where is it? Are we fighting cowbells to use? So absolutely, you look at the average consumer. We are consuming more. If you look at the savings rate, I just looked at this morning. Savings rate has been about the same. So on aggregate, we're not spending out savings. On average, we are spending based on new income, and overall, our savings rate stayed are healthy. So it is, we're spending out on that discretionary spending in a very healthy way on average. However, as I was putting that very lowest income household, their real incomes are keeping up with inflation, and they're adding more debt and more. There's a larger share of higher delinquencies to that very lowest income household. So that's a good story for people to think about. For all our small businesses in Ukraine, most households are doing fine, and there's one household top. Now there is shifts in patterns. So one example is home services. One way we're dealing with some of this cost inflation and why it hasn't shifted is we're shifting decisions at the grocery store. Maybe not the most expensive milk or the most expensive whatever. Moving away we make to something else that substitutes, keeps our costs down. And home services, we have a lot of things. Well, maybe I'll mow my lawn right now instead of having someone else do it. Maybe I won't get that tree cut down, so we're foregoing some costs. So there are definitely some consumption shifts, even though on aggregate we're still concerned. Piggyback that, do you think that ties to the domestic outflows of the population outflows? Like it's just too expensive for those folks in that lower income percentage to stay here, affordability much?
Are you speaking more towards Johnson County and it's that? Probably done. I mean,
Yeah, it might be done. Yeah.
I think what we've seen in the last several years, particularly with say the domestic migration number went negative the last 2 years. I think we've seen, historically Johnson County had been a magnet for young people, especially out-of-state Kansans, who are leaving rural communities and moving to the metro. And Johnson County was a big beneficiary of those folks moving in. I think there's been a real shift in that behavior. A couple of reasons for that is that the populations in rural Kansas have been declining for decades, and there's not that many people moving out of those communities any longer. And then the revitalization of the urban core in Kansas City has become very attractive for young folks, young college graduates, for example, who might have previously lived in Johnson County. A lot of them are moving to the Crossroads and River Market and markets like that. So those are all working together. Not to mention the declining birth rates. So but there's a lot of factors that have caused our slowdown in population growth. As cost is also probably in that mix as well.
I would just add that our costs are low relative to many parts of the country, but compared to other Midwestern cities, our costs are increasing a little bit faster in many. And so we are beginning to lose our cost of management. So I could back my equipment.
And translated.
Becky, please. Any others from the crowd? I do want to throw out, talk about, you meet with and talk to a number of businesses within the area, and obviously this is a district. Can you talk a little bit about consumer confidence and what you're hearing from those businesses that you each speak to that a little bit? It might push like you have.
You know, your first, you're being a first. I will say, when we talk to large firms, they are, especially this last month, they were extremely optimistic about the market, given where we are in slowing market conditions, right? And that's large firms, right? There's a very different market today for a large firm versus the medium firms versus small. The lower you go, I think you start coming into more problems, and it depends on what segments you're in. So when you have a really good year or you're having less confidence. So, for example, home services, those people that right in that market, we're seeing consumption and change in available labor, and that's shrinking down at the same time and making it a little bit more difficult. One very large company in the home services showed that their decline of 40% in sales from January all the way to today, and this is normally built up. So there's low confidence there. And access to capital, access to credit, been more of an issue when I go to smaller firms. So what's confidence there? A lot more difficulty in labor. A lot more concerns that they can't do price negotiation, or they're stuck on the price receiving side. They get a lot more negative conditions of finding it more difficult than the larger firms who can control inventory, control costs, control labor, all of that.
I'll say my benchmark for consumer confidence is when I go to Prairie Village and go get my donuts or whatever, my pastries in the morning, and I'm just amazed at how crowded it is, even in sort of all hours of the day. So people are spending money. It's exactly right. People are still spending, but I don't believe that they're investing, not making the big purchases maybe. There's just less confidence and prosperity. They may, I'm really some. For some things they might already bought because the price will end up, but now they're going to hang down to be forward.
Well, I agree with what they said. We at Siri, we go around the table every board meeting and ask business leaders, what they're seeing in their market. And the past couple of years, last year, the year before, there was a lot of talk about being really busy, had lots of new business to add to their books, coupled with shortage of available labor. Now we're beginning to see, we haven't met since June, but in the spring, there was a lot of uncertainty with the tariff situation. And so I think a lot of business decisions were kind of put on pause. You're hearing a lot of that soaring information coming nationally that businesses were kind of just hitting the pause button, waiting to see what the effects are going to be. So far, the effects haven't really come home to roost quite yet. There's more and more talk that they eventually will in terms of pricing. But I think businesses are beginning to make a little more movement on pulling the trigger on projects. This is a lot of anecdotal data, information I'm kind of processing through my head and regurgitating to you, but that's kind of what we're seeing is that there has been about a 6-month period where a lot of businesses can kind of just pulling back a little bit and waiting and see. But we are hearing that decisions are beginning to go to be made to go ahead and lead with projects. Well, you guys, federal policy. We talked a little bit about tariffs, interest rates. Kansas City hasn't, seen a lot of the peaks and valleys. We've been somewhat steady over the last, but we're not immune to federal policy issues. Can you talk a little bit about that and immigration, labor, policies that are dictated a lot outside of Kansas City and how that's impacting this region? And we've been picking any of those topics. I think everyone's interested because how that's fit in my opinion. Well, I'll start with the immigration issue since I already showed our population growth and those components. International migration prior couple of years has been a big component of our population growth, and so I think that was if that is significantly slow, our population growth is going to slow further. Our labor force growth is going to slow further, so the labor market will get tighter. We hear talk about AI loosening labor demands. I think it's going to be a while before that really starts to have a big impact. Eventually, I think it will include child productivity, being able to be more with less labor. But I think there's going to be a transition period if immigration really is slowed significantly, that it's going to tighten the labor market.
Well, I'll stay on the same theme of breaker. So, talk about population and some of the fertility rates. The Midwest is generally, even Kansas City, we are never tracking economic migrants. Even here, although this is a much better market to attract economic migrants, but it's less. So then you ask about how you're going to grow them, and we're not growing them at the same pace we did before. We're actually being slow. So that's fundamental drivers of slowly growth. When you look at the amount of job openings, right, versus available labor, during COVID, we actually got much worse than the nation here in Kansas at the state level, like Kansas, Missouri. We got much higher. We have a lot more job openings than we had available labor. So we're having more pressure on this labor side of this equation. So, and one solution, and it is on both sides, skilled labor and unskilled labor is what we highly need at Kansas City and here in the Midwest. And economic migrants, for migrants is a solution, but economic migrants is another one. So then you have to get to how does that solve the problem? Or do firms have to relocate to other locations to get access to that labor? And that's been a fundamental problem for the region for a while, is where is that labor supply? And they go to other places because they find it easier to trap that economic migrant. So that's a fundamental problem on policy when in reality, not just in Johnson County, but in Wichita or Topeka or Manhattan or Lawrence, you get foreign migrants is always about the same. It's high labor here, so we need that skilled labor and to fill that demand.
Yeah, I would say on labor and say that virtually all the net growth in our labor force has been from foreign migrants. And so for the region to grow, for the national economy to grow, we need migrants, and that's being vastly curtailed, so that does not speak well for the economic growth. We need more people, we need more workers to pay for things like Social Security, the transfer payment from workers to the government. And so the policies that we're pursuing nationally are pretty much anti-growth. There's enough problems out there with construction costs, the issue is that the industry is being to stay high for a while longer because of inflationary pressures to add on top of that the uncertainties between the military and the immigration policy really ends up being an anti-growth strategy in the state pursued, and we'll get through it. We'll be fine to the end, but it is tricky work on tomorrow's.
Did we talk about more policy? Sure. So one thing that's interesting is when you look at construction side, under the previous administration, they had all this money for construction. A lot of that big industrial or big road construction. A lot of that under this administration actually stayed the exact same. You're wondering how much that would change. So when I talk to some of the big construction side to this, they're still seeing this large demand for it not changing significantly. But that's a federal policy. What's another one that I was thought about? Oh, tariffs themselves. We have less supply chain issues, less supply chain access, less alternative suppliers is what I meant. And so that's putting a lot of risk to our firms or manufacturing firms today. And we have very rigid supply chain system, automotive and aerospace, who you can't change it. So it's how do you pass it on and how does that manufacturers run directly? So that's putting pressure. And agriculture. A lot of commodities here, and the commodity side, it is struggling and putting some downward pressure on that sector.
Can you talk a little bit? We had a meeting earlier today, a small round table. Can you talk a little bit about inflation, kind of where we are now, and the impact of COVID, and and interest rates, and then now kind of where we are now, and how they're.
So when we talk about it, I think really so rates themselves and talking about it correspond back to the mortgage rates that we're looking at here,
cost of goods and things like that, and how it's come, the inflation or cost of all things, these services has got under control. You share a little bit about that.
So the first part of the year we saw some upward inflation, and that was very concerning at that point because it wasn't a driving factor for it. And what we don't want is unanchored inflation. We don't want a market in an economy where I don't know what inflation is going to be tomorrow as a firm because I don't know how to handle my labor, or I don't know how to handle my input goods, so I just keep increasing prices. And that was a little bit of concern in January or February. Since then, the Federal Reserve had to really ratchet it down. They would start thinking about with that more restrictive policy. And that's kind of what they said it's been for a while, so that we get back to this more anchored price inflation. The alternative is, some of you might remember, late 70s, 80s, when inflation was much higher. That was that unanchored inflation. And Greenspan had to break the back inflation to get it back under control, right? But so now we're looking at it today, the inflation that we're seeing is coming back up. More about that inflation from tariffs. We also want to make sure, and that's clearly one of the reasons why we're talking about being moderately restricted. That's why rates didn't really come down these last month. There's still full employment, a lot of demand in the economy, and so they're trying to keep it so we can keep that inflation under control. But now we have, as a Federal Reserve, we have a dual way to take, right? We have to have a stable economy, right? We have full employment, and those two are coming unanchored to each other. We have to figure out what you have to deal with. When you go forward, right now we're still talking about the inflation side of the story because we don't want it to be unanchored because that has a bigger risk, like we're remembering the economy 80s, some of you might remember that, versus this labor side of the story, which is beginning further. At some point, it might flip where the board might look over the next one to deal with those issues.
One last chance. Come on.
On the federal level, how is some of the HUD decisions, not as urban development decisions that affect us on the local level?
Which decisions are you talking about? Right. Which decisions are you talking about?
They were talking about cutting back on some of the development funds and then the housing in our money going to recipients housing.
I'm not fully attuned to all those policy changes there and how it affects, but I mean, HUD itself has definitely a clear part of a segment of housing, right? Particularly in urban and poor, and then so that could have an effect on an already vulnerable society, but that's a speculation based on what you're saying. I don't know what we tell us.
Fine. Okay.
Well, we are right up against 1 o'clock. So can we give our speakers a round of applause? I neglect that we do have one of our elected officials here, B. Baptiste, who has a lot to deal with here in the city and moving forward. And so we're very glad that he's here to hear about this information. And so, thank you for everything you do for us as well. I'd like to also thank our hosts, MAU directly, and they were a sponsor. And so thank you all for hosting us. It's a great run. We're very venue. So thank you. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.